Okay, so uh, we are now beginning the keynote session, and our keynote speaker for today is Oghenechovwe Donald Ekpeki, the Pantheologist. He is the most awarded SFF writer, editor, and publisher on the African continent. Between 2018 and 2023, he's won so many awards, the Nebula, several Nomos, and numerous others that listing it would be very difficult. Uh, he's a writer, he's an editor, he's a publisher. Most of his honors have been racial or continental firsts in the genre. His works have been published by Asimovs, Fantasy and Science Fiction, Uncanny Magazine, Tor, Macmillan, and others. He is a member of the board and virtual conference coordinator at the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts. He created the line of year's best African speculative fiction anthologies and was the first Black African man to be a guest of honor at the Afrofuturism themed International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. There, he coined the genre label Afropantheology, created and championed other subgenres such as Caribbean Pantheology, Indopantheology, and the overarching Pantheology project and School of Thought. So, with these few words, I welcome Ekpeki and request him to deliver the keynote address for our conference.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being around. I hope you can hear me. Please wave if you can hear me. I'm not sure if you can hear me. So, okay. Yeah, so thanks for being here. I'll be delivering my keynote speech on the topic, which is spirituality beyond borders, progress through cultural reclamations in Afropantheology and the great beyond, and its concurrent streamflow with futurisms in the time cycle. So that probably sounds like a mouthful. So um, I'll start with um, I'll start with a very simple quote from China Achebe. It goes like this. You may have heard it before. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. You know, it's essentially talking about the importance of storytelling, you know, which is a very large part of what literature does. You know, um, a lot of our literature, a lot of our books, they tell stories, and the stories that the people tell plays a very important role in shaping them, in defining, how their trajectory, you know. So um most of what we do today is bound by stories, is determined by stories on a very um on a very involved, or um on almost every level, of our lives. There's a form of storytelling involved. Storytelling is not only when you pick up a book, a novel, or you pick up a movie, or when you listen to a song, there's a story there. A love song tells you about lovers, about their lives, about the relationship. There's a story in almost everything you do. When you look at a picture, it tells you a story. Even though it's stationary, it tells you a story of what's going on. You know, today let's talk about let's even go beyond the arts. Let's look at supposedly more technical aspects of things like advertising, like branding, like the average everyday product that you use, right? Your phones, there's a story about it. For example, let's look at Apple. Apple is the most I think it's the biggest brand currently. It's the company with the largest market cap on it. You pick up an iPhone and Apple is telling you a story with that phone. You know, what is it people usually say about iPhones? They tell you about their premium. It's a premium brand, right? They tell you it's it's for the cool kids. It's exclusive. It's they tell you the camera is amazing. There's no other camera like it. That's a story. That's the story behind the product, right? If you pick up an Android phone, they tell you it's versatile. You can do a lot of things with your Android phone. It's cheaper than your iPhone, so it's supposed to be a budget device for people that know better than to spend money on luxury. So that's the story. They're telling you that if you use the product, you're a smart person. It's a story. Every product, every brand tells you a story. Basically, every most of what you will encounter in life, both animate, inanimate objects, there's a story bound up in it, right? You know, the whole idea of, and it goes beyond just products, it goes beyond just art, right? Even our institutions have stories, right? That's why we go to school, because they tell us if you're in school, if you have an education, then you can be someone in life. It's a story that guides you towards a certain position. You know, every time I've had the opportunity to travel a couple of times and to apply for visas, especially to Western countries, and every time you sit in front of a visa person who's going to screen you for visas, you tell them a story about yourself, what you're going to do while you're traveling, right? Who you are. Because the story of who you are matters. And that person carries a story in their head about you, right? Because there are stories about us out there in the world already, which are not determined by us. Before I go for that visa interview, to tell that person a story about myself, the person already has a story about me in their head, right? They've heard I'm Nigerian. They've heard certain things about me, about Nigerians, even if not about me personally. Some of it not positive. For example, they will tell you, they look at me and they remember the story of the Nigerian prince, in quote, the fraudster, who swindles people. They hear the story of the hustler. They hear the story of the person from a broken country who's looking to escape to greener pastures. So they believe that I'm not going to honor the terms of my visa. So they deny me that visa because the story that they have tells them that I'm this kind of person, I'm that kind of person. It tells them what I'm going to do, it tells them who I am, and they treat me accordingly. Do you understand? So the stories that are out there about us are very important. They shape our trajectory, they shape where we end up in life, which is why the Achebe quote comes back again, right? We have to take charge of our own stories. We have to decide where we're going. We have to decide who we are, because stories are power. They have a power over us. So we've talked about branding, we've talked about products. we've talked about companies, we've talked about institutions, we've talked about art. It extends beyond just that. It extends down to even religion, right? Religion, you could say that there are stories. There are stories from sources that we say are divine, right? But there are stories that tell us this is where we come from. This is our origin. This is the story of the world, of its creation, of of God. Even God, even spirituality. They carry stories of how we are supposed to behave, of the meaning of life, of where we're going, which in turn guides everything we do, how we live our lives. So you could say stories are the most important parts of us. They talk about how the body is made up of 70% water, or a large percent of water. And I would say that life itself, human life, is made up of as much stories as water. So um, we have to be very conscious of storytelling. We have to realize that it's not just something that it's not just something you do when you pick up a novel. It's not relegated to a certain group of people, who are in this class. It affects everybody. It permeates every aspect of our lives. Whether we are engineers, you're going to tell a story. Whether you're doctors, right? You tell stories. Whether you're even a WWE fighter, in the wrestlers in WWE, they have stories. That's why people follow them. People follow. It's like combat sports as well. There's storytelling involved. MMA, mixed martial art, boxing. That's why the fighters have a backstory. They create rivalries, even if it's fake. Because stories, they understand at a fundamental level that stories are the crux of human life. It's what makes us tick. It's what makes us move. Stretching even beyond all of that, religion, products, branding, companies, art. You talk about something as simple as borders. You know, what basically decides where is where? Geography. Geography and borders, they are also stories. Someone tells you this is Africa. Africa stretches from this place to that place to that place, or this is India, or this is Asia, right? That's a story. And it essentially guides who lives where, who goes where, who does what. So yeah. Having talked about the importance of stories, I'll diverge a bit before I get into the meat of my talk. I'll diverge a bit and talk about the storyteller, you know, because you can't have stories without a storyteller. Stories are propagated by people, stories are carried by people, they are put out by people. So, you can't have art without the artist, you can't have stories without the storyteller, you can't have literature without the writer. So, talking about one necessitates the subject of the other as well. So I'll talk about myself a bit, because yeah, like I said, the two are intertwined. Um, okay, first of all, creating this, being here today in front of you, I'm going to tell you a bit about my journey. It was it almost didn't happen. It nearly didn't happen. The level of organization involved was it was almost traumatic. I was worried, trying to figure everything out, trying to put all the pieces together to be able to be here in front of you, to be able to like speak to you. At some point, I told Shreyasi that I was going to be here even if it killed me. It probably sounded dramatic at some point, but sometimes that's the kind of mindset that is required for certain people in certain places to be seen, to be heard, to be able to tell their stories. You sort of have to be ready to die for it. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's a harsh reality that I promised myself I was going to bring up. I was not sure I wanted to, because I want to be inspirational. I want to share good tidings about literature, about life, about but it's necessary to talk about the harsh realities of things, of where we are, because if we don't have an accurate if we don't have an accurate position of where we are, it's going to be difficult to chart a correct course. It's kind of like your Google Maps, right? If you're going to chart a course from somewhere to somewhere else, you have to know where you are, right? It shows you where you are, then it shows you where you're going, then it plots the map, it shows you the time it's going to take. But without knowing exactly where you are, it's harder to see the whole picture. And where I am, it's not great. It's not a pretty picture. Several days ago, there was a collapse of undersea cables that deliver network, internet network to several West African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, a couple of them. So our internet, like all over the country, has been pretty terrible. Like even like institutions, banking institutions, billion-dollar institutions have been having problems, telecoms, what have you. So I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make this call, have enough data to be here. So that's the first thing. In fact, even our in the best of times, our internet is not great. Besides internet, there's power outage, right? I've not had a week of consistent power, electricity since I've been born. Like I mean it practically my whole life. You know, Africa is the poorest continent in the world, and Nigeria is the poverty capital of the world. I think at some point it was India, but we beat you guys to it. So yay, we're the champions now. So it's it goes on and on. It's the capital of open defecation. It has, I think, the second lowest life expectancy on earth, which is about 52. Yeah, it's about 52, right? And I think you may not realize how terrible that is, but um okay, I'll give you an example. In America, the black American man, is considered in danger, right, from police brutality, from a number of other issues. And the black American man facing police brutality in the US has a life expectancy of over 70. It means that even in a place like that, where they are facing the most dire challenges, racism, and everything else, they will live 20 years on average longer than the average Nigerian in Nigeria. Do you realize how terrible that is? 20 years, that's 2 decades. It's a lifetime. It's enough time to have another whole life, right? You know, many of us are possibly in our 20s, maybe mid 20s, maybe 30s. If you're in a place like this, that prognosis means you have less to live than you've already lived. And you understand that where you are right now, in your 20s, 30s, you basically haven't done much. You possibly not had kids yet, possibly not, there's still a lot left to do. So it means we get to live less. You get to live less. This is not to be dire, not to be negative, but we have to understand the realities facing the storyteller. Because the stories that you can tell about yourself, how you influence, everything that you do is bound by these factors, right? How much are you allowed? What do you have? What tools are bound that you can tell your story with, right? You know. So yeah, which brings me back to Achebe's quote, right? Um until the lion has its own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Yeah, so yes, we've established that stories are important, stories are necessary, and all of that. But what goes even further beyond that is how. How do we tell our stories, right? What kind of stories do we tell? Like telling stories is fine and good, but what about all the other things involved? Who is allowed to tell what stories? What tools are they allowed? What time? Right? So there's it goes further than just establishing the necessity and the importance, which is why we're all gathered here today to try to figure out, okay, what stories matter, who should tell them, how should they tell them, and all of that. So um I've been opportune to travel several times. Speaking of traveling, I would go back a bit and touch on I will still touch on some of the problems facing the storyteller from where I am, from the continent, from Nigeria, from certain places which have factors that we even share in common. You know, um, yeah, I was talking about power outages. I was talking about network. I was talking about all of that, and a simple solution might come to mind. Someone might say, "Why don't you just travel? Why don't I just go there? Why don't I just go give the speech?" And that seems like a simple solution, but it comes with its own set of problems. The problem of economics, right? The problem of funding, right? Money is a problem because traveling requires funds, right? And the economics of the world is built to impact certain peoples in certain ways, to keep them in certain places. For example, the fees during the December period, the Christmas holidays, a lot of Nigerians were traveling from other places from the West back home. And it turned out that the cost of traveling, the cost of flight tickets to Nigeria was extremely more expensive than from certain other places to other places that were even further. So it's sort of like it's sort of like the economics of things are built to impact the storyteller here differently. You know, the last time, not the last time, one of the times I traveled to give a keynote speech, I traveled to the US. I think that was last year. Yeah, I was invited to be the guest of honor at the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. I was going to be the first black man to be the guest of honor at that event. It's an event that has had, Stephen King, J.R.R. Martin, Nadia Okora for some of the most important writers ever as guest of honor. They've even had two Nobel Prize winners, So I was going for something that important. I was going for two things actually. The NAACP Image Award, I was nominated for it. So the ceremony was taking place, the award ceremony. I was invited. So I was going for those two events. The NAACP is one of the most. It's the most important Black award. It's highly celebrated by people much more important than myself, like Michael Jackson. So I had two very important reasons to be there. I had a visa, a valid visa, but on arrival, I was detained by the Customs and Border Patrol in the US. I was detained. I was kept there and I was interrogated for the longest time in conditions that fit the legal definition of torture. I studied law, so legally, I can tell you, you can define it as torture legally and not be wrong, right? So this is just to buttress what it takes sometimes, what it means for you from certain places to carry your story out there into the world or to decide that you want to take charge of your story. So um I'll go back. I'll go back to Achebe's quote. Um yeah. I was traveling. I was traveling. I will still talk about it from the prism of my experiences. The second time I traveled, I mean, after that fiasco with CBP, I was going to Europe and I was supposed to be a guest of honor at Italcon at a convention in Italy, Stranimondi. It was my first time visiting Italy. I mean, every time I've ever traveled in my life has been because of my stories, like literally, the first time I left, the first time I ever left the continent, the African continent, was my stories, literally. I was nominated for the Hugo Award and I had to attend the award ceremony. I've been invited to China, Italy, Czech Republic, Germany, and each of those times it's been my story. It's been about my work. So I'm trying to say that yeah, your stories will provide avenues for you, you know, even though there's going to be constraints because the number of places I've mentioned, I've only visited about a handful of them. Most of the times, I've either been unable to procure a visa or unable to travel or being detained or there's always something. The world tries to confine us as much as our stories give us opportunities. The world also tries to confine our stories, to control us with them, you know. So yeah, but this particular time I was opportune to travel to Italy, so we passed several countries on the way. We stopped at one of the African countries. I can't remember. Then we stopped at France before we got to Italy. So I was, I basically passed through about 3 or 4 or 5 airports. Going and coming. Yeah, it was number of airports. I was at airports a lot. We had a lot of stops. So, and I noticed something in most of the airports I saw, which is bringing us to the next phase in the topic, which is um, I'm talking about yeah, I'm still talking about stories, but I'm looking at where we find our stories and how they move across the world. You know, I'll say something more about stories that are fundamental. They carry our ideas, right? Um, I had an essay in the African futurism, Afrofuturism textbook. There was a textbook on Afrofuturism which I contributed to. Let me check for the name so I can recommend it. Yeah, Conjuring Words, an Afrofuturist textbook. So I had an essay that was titled Saving the World Through Fiction, the Place of Afro and Other Futurisms and Diversity in Representation. So in it, I was talking about how stories play a very educative role, right? They basically tell us, they carry a lot of information, right? Apart from telling the story of a people, which we say they do, of saying who you are, of defining you, your identity, and what you're supposed to do. They also carry a lot of practical information. For example, you might learn more from engineering. You might learn more about science. You might learn more about religion. You might learn more about love. You will learn most things that will carry you through your life from stories more than you will from textbooks. I mean, yeah, I know we're students, but let's be honest. We do a lot more for fun than we do for education, you know. And so when stories that are supposed to be fun carry bits of education, and they usually always do, we end up getting more. In there's an essay by Wole Talabi, an African writer, in Uncanny Magazine, why it's titled "Why Africans Should Write More Science Fiction." It talks about the fact that most people in STEM, most students in STEM and in science courses were inspired to do that by mad scientist movies, right? So we get inspired. A lot of people will be inspired to be astronauts from movies they watch, from science fiction movies. A lot of people will be inspired to be doctors, to be engineers from stories they hear. So stories carry ideas, you know, they carry problems, they carry solutions to problems. And so how stories travel around the world matters, right? Because if they carry our ideas, then it means that if they travel around the world, we get to share ideas, we get to share ideas in a more compact and complete way. They carry our problems around the world. We get to interact with each other. There's more empathy. We can see, we can understand ourselves better, right? When I watch a Bollywood movie, I see that, okay, this is how Indians are, this is how they live, this is what they do, right? I can understand you more. I can understand you better from your stories. You can understand me better. You can see my problems. And then when those stories carry our solutions, you get to see those solutions, right? So But when our stories are limited, it means that we exist in a vacuum. We exist in a vacuum. And if you exist in a vacuum, you're not seeing the world is global, is connected. We all have the same problems. But if our stories are not traveling around, then we're not going to be able to collectively solve the problems of the world. So apart from just having stories, we have to have stories that transcend borders, right? I believe the theme of this is Africa beyond borders. Our stories have to be beyond borders. Our spiritualities have to be beyond borders. We have to share our stories. We have to carry our stories. You know, which is where translation comes in. Translations. But no, here's the thing I was talking about. While traveling, I was in I was at different airports in different places, speaking different languages. And I noticed that in each airport I got to, I'm a science fiction writer, science fiction, fantasy. So those are the works that I look out for mostly. I noticed that at each airport, for example, when I was in France, I would see a number of works in French. And the majority of them, 90% of them, would be the same set of works, the same set of authors that were translated into French, right? For example, I'll see works by Stephen King, I'll see works by J.K. Rowling, I'll see works by Susan Collins, The Hunger Games, I'll see works by Stephen Meyers, Twilight. They were the same set of works. When I go to a French airport, when I go to an Italian airport, they were the same set of works. When I go to everywhere I went to, I saw the same set of works translated into different languages. And let me tell you, it was works by the same set of people, from the same demographic, it was works by white people, by white men, either American or British. And there's a problem there. There's a huge problem. It means that literature is not transcending borders, right? It's not transcending borders. So the ideas that we carry, our ideas are limited. The world is living in a vacuum because it's propagating the same stories over and over again. Which brings me to the very idea of fantasy. I'm a science fiction fantasy writer, right? And these books are mostly science fiction fantasy. Mostly fantasy, which is what I look out for. Now, fantasy is usually it deals with the fantastical, with the spiritual. If you read Harry Potter, Stephen King, horror, the bunch of them. Now, the fantasy genre, those names I mentioned, they're sort of synonymous with the genre, right? They tell you fantasy. Fantasy essentially is defined by certain names. Stephen King, like I said, horror, though. Robert Jordan, the certain number of names. But you see, fantasy is much broader than that, and the rest of it is usually not seen. Now, one of the fundamental things about the fantasy genre is it usually has what you call magic systems, right? Which are how the characters in the world interact, with it's a building block of the world, right? Like in Harry Potter, you had wands, magic spells, you have magic systems. Now, most of these so-called magic systems are built off of the spiritualities of different cultures, right? They're built off of spiritualities of different cultures. A lot of your Western books, like The Wheel of Time, a good number of them, right? Dune, we recently saw the movie Dune. We talked about is based off of North African, Middle Eastern, Islamic culture. A lot of your fantasy books have magic systems that are built off of the spiritualities of of these places, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, including India. So our spiritualities seem to be traveling, seem to be transcending borders, but in an altered way, right? A lot of the times, these people who use them in their works don't acknowledge the influences. And when they do, it's relegated to the term fantasy, which does not seem like a problem. But you see, there is a problem, one of categorization. How you call a thing, how you name a thing, it affects how it's seen. In the same way that storytelling does. The stories that you tell define you. The name that you carry, names are titles, right? Of stories. So the title of a story matters. In the same way, the name of a thing matters. So when we call these things are not fantasies, they're based off of cultures, they're based off of religions, of real living people. So when we call them fantasies, it tends to remove from the importance. It tends to remove from the core of it. It makes it something else, which might not seem like a serious problem. But if we look at our history, if we look at the history of the world, slavery, colonialism, which happened wholesale in Africa, in India, it you will find that it matters. It was deliberate. That was one of the first things that happened when we were colonized, was that our religions were altered, our stories were changed. They were cut off and altered to fit what the storytellers then wanted us to be seen as. Right? For example, most of African traditional religion has mostly been demonized. Most of our gods are referred to as demons. They talk about Ishu, the Yoruba deity is considered Satan, which he isn't. And most of our benevolent gods, who should be the equivalent of, the benevolent gods in Christian and colonizing religions, are not considered to be that, even though we do have benevolent deities. So, one of the things that was done by colonialism and slavery was to alter our stories, our religions, our spiritualities, to try to cut them down or alter them to be negative. So when we have these stories that innocently carry our spiritualities, but they are altered, it removes from the power, it removes from the trust, it removes from who we are. So, which is why after that trip, I started a project called the Pantheology project. Right, pantheology is the study of gods, religions, and bodies of knowledge. So I started to think of genre of fantasy. What if instead of fantasy, we had pantheologies, which acknowledges the source of these stories, which allows for the fact that their spiritualities, their spiritual realities from cultures of people. Now we're able to call the thing what it is. We can define it. We can define stories and acknowledge the source of these spiritualities. So instead of transcending borders, instead of having our spiritualities transcend borders as fantasy or as folklore or as mythologies, they're not mythologies. They're not myths, because most of these um, world, Western religions, you wouldn't call them myths. If you did, there would be problems. So the religions, the spiritualities of people from of people of color should not also be called myths or mythologies. They're pantheologies. So what if instead of fantasy we had pantheologies? We had, say, Indopantheology, we had Afropantheology, we had, you know, I think that would be a stronger step forward in reclaiming our stories, in telling our stories, in having our spiritualities transcend borders in ways that, that is more representative of who we are, you know. And while we're talking about pantheologies, there's something else that comes to mind: futurisms. We talk about futurisms a lot at the trajectory of the world, where it's going. It's also part of telling our stories the right way, because one of the things colonialism did, apart from take away our stories, was cut us off in the future. Right, a lot of people of color are not in stories of the future. So futurism aims to correct that, like Afrofuturism, for example, indigenous futurisms. So pantheologies, Afropantheology, Indopantheology, Caribbean pantheology, the different pantheologies are going to be doing the same thing, reclaiming our stories, our spiritualities, and working in tandem with futurisms, sort of different sides of the same coin or adjacent. Pantheologies having to do with religion and spirituality, it would be easy to consider it the opposite of futurisms. Religions often have to deal with origins, with where we come from, with creation. They usually have a creation story. So it can seem like the opposite of futurism, but I tend to think more of time as a circle, right? Instead of a linear straight line, right? As streams flowing into each other, right? Past and present. Um, it's sort of, they're linked. So I I I I think of pantheologies and futurisms as one thing. Afropantheology is Afrofuturism from different perspective, right? Indo-pantheology would be another perspective of Indo-futurism. If you champion that, it's kind of like in Einstein's theory of relativity. Everything is relative, right? Motion is relative depending on your reference point. Time, speed, and all of that. So, if we look at history, talking about time, it's not exactly been two different points of past and future, right? It's been sort of more of a cycle. We're not moving from one definite point to another definite point. It's more like we're going round and round. We're doing the same things over and over again. The past is the future, and the future is the past. Sometimes we have to go backward to go forward. And by going forward, we're also moving backwards. So I'll give some examples so you understand what I mean. The ideas of progress, of progressiveness, a lot of the things that we are supposedly progressing towards are things that are rooted in our past. For example, let's look at gender and sexuality. Ideas of gender and sexuality, we talk about fluidity, right? Yeah, sex is non-binary, and gender is fluid. But you see, we've always had those concepts and those ideas in the past. For example, in my language, in Yoruba, we don't have a word that differentiates between brother and sister. There's one term, onyovu, right, which covers both male and female siblings. So we've always had gender fluid language in the past. And our language, that was condemned. Our languages were said to be limited, but now the world is progressing supposedly towards our past, right? If you look at things like polygamy was condemned in African societies, but now the world is also progressing towards that past in things like polyamory. We have polyamorous relationships, fluid relationships, which we've always had in the past. So our past is the so-called future, right? So it's like we're progressing backwards. If you look at so many things, the world is also pushing for planting of trees, conservation. Back in the past, we also had so-called evil forest. We had like sacred groves, which were inviolate, but which, the West referred to as superstition, and those forests were cleared and cut down. But now we're moving towards planting trees, because that's scientifically beneficial for the environment. So are we really progressing, or are we just going back to where we were? There's a number of I could pick a number of examples like that. Look at global warming, look at climate change. We always had ways to manage those things in the past that the world is stumbling towards. Look at healing, medicine. We had a lot of medicinal practices, in the past, meditation techniques, bone setting, and now the world is moving towards therapy, which we've always had, so I always encourage thinking of time and human progress as a cycle, which is what which is why I talk about my title talks about um it talked about the stream flow with future concurrent stream flows with futurisms in the time cycle. I think of time as a cycle. I think of pantheologies and futurisms as concurrent streams running together instead of, you know, and yeah. So that's essentially my keynote in a nutshell. In um, yeah, I would just circle back to my original quote again from China Achebe. Um, yeah, and say that we should endeavor to carry our stories with us, our stories, our spiritualities, our pantheologies. We should endeavor to carry them with us in a deliberate way. We should be intentional. We should carry our stories with us. We should take them beyond borders, our stories, our spiritualities, because only through doing that can we completely claim our power and be who we are meant to be, in the stream of time. So that's essentially I think I've used up my time. So yeah.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I'd like to thank you especially. Uh, People here should realize that there is a long time gap between and Kolkata. There's also a very serious internet problem here, and because uh, Ekpeki didn't want to disappoint us, he wanted to join personally rather than sending a recorded talk. So he made sure, with a lot of difficulty, that he would actually be with us. Uh, we don't have question answers for our keynote sessions, but I'm sure that some of our students and others would be keen to continue to keep in touch with him. Things that we should better realize now is that as long as market driven, uh, the science fiction and fantasy that we read is usually science fiction and fantasy written by US, UK authors, and that's only one corner of the world. The kind of stuff which is produced elsewhere is different, and this center, from its birth, has had the ideological position that the ex colonial world should contact other parts of the ex colonial world directly without going through the mediation of the powerful metropolises on top, which is why we do have this kind of exchange. So, with that, once again, I'll thank you for your talk. We are probably running slightly behind schedule, but we have made up a little bit. But we will now have to move on to uh, the other sessions. So thanks, and if we can manage to get the funds to publish, we will certainly write to you for a written version of your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Srovana, it's over to you.